remember got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember like back at FGCU when I like before we went virtual, right? So when I was gonna like have you in my class, the cameras were like at a weird angle. So I had like somebody like I had to talk to somebody who would come in and install different cameras so that this could be possible, you know. So I hope you didn't have to do any of that.
I did actually.
Oh,
This class doesn't really have its own unique equipment. So for each
yeah.
of my guest lectures, I actually rent the whole equipment from school. And then our Strassler center comes and helps me set it up so that our
I
students
see.
can have
Oh, well,
do it. So,
never mind then.
but so I will start with your introduction,
Of
and
course.
then can go ahead and take the stage and start your talk. So, hello everyone. Here we have Dr. Arnold Dr. Roy, who is a good friend of mine and a colleague from Florida Gulf Coast University. We met actually back at Stockton University when I was a postdoc and he was an assistant professor. His research is located in the intersection of post-colonialism, human rights theory, and modern South Asian literature, and has appeared in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Global Postcolonial Studies, South Asian Review, American Book Review, Humanities. His current book project, Universalism in South Asian Literature, draws on interdisciplinary work in postcolonial theory and human rights to analyze literary responses to colonialism from South Asia. He is a faculty fellow at FGCU Center for Race and Ethnic Studies, serves as an advisory board member of the Society for Comparative Literature and Arts, and teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on world literature at FGCU. His talk today is titled Literary Representations of War and Genocide. So as you can see, connected to our reading, the whole idea of how we can use fiction or fiction literature in better understanding violence, war, and genocide. So Arnav, now the stage is yours.
Awesome. I may have to, I don't know if I'll be able to share or I
I'll
might.
give you a pause, so probably you will.
Okay, I got it.
Awesome.
Can you all see it?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Asya, for that wonderful introduction. I'm so honored to be here, and it's great getting this opportunity to come and talk and interact with you. So the title of my presentation today is Literary Representations of War and Genocide. I think one of the first questions when one connects the idea of genocide or war to literature comes. One of the first questions that we ask is, can or should genocide be represented through fiction? I mean, and here we are like using words like fiction and literature interchangeably, because I mean, the common assumption is facts are the domains of history and fiction is the domain of literature. So we are running with that kind of an assumption. So can or should genocide be represented through literature? So I'm gonna just ask you, what do you guys think? Any thoughts on this? Wait. Yes.
Um, I think that like historical fiction can be kind of a powerful like medium for understanding genocide that makes it like more palatable for like different generations. Like in middle school, for example, like reading historical fiction helps you like about like kids point of view,
Mhm.
helped us to kind of try to understand what the children were going through during like the Holocaust, for example. I think it is valuable in a certain sense, but once it becomes commodified, it's tricky.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, pretty much. That's a great response. And I'm gonna like talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But thank you for that. Anybody else wants to give it a shot? I can see like tiny versions of you, so I don't necessarily will not be able to see you raising a hand.
I'll throw out my thoughts.
Okay.
I like historical fiction. I'm really pretty like loosey-goosey about historical fiction, even like if you think of Inglorious Bastards, I think that that's okay to do. I enjoy Inglorious Bastards. So yeah, I think I'm pretty okay with historical fiction overall.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, I feel historical fiction is okay when it comes to representations. But like the question is, what in historical fiction say? I mean, there are other genres that represent genocide and war as well. What is it in those forms, those genres that make it valuable? Did somebody else raise a hand?
No, we just have one more student joining us, so.
Okay, awesome. Okay, okay. Yeah, as I said, like you all look like Lilliputians to me from in this tiny screen, so it's hard to like really say like anyway. So thank you for those two responses. They're really great, and they kind of will allow a segue into the next part of the next slide actually. So I mean, this question, can genocide be represented through fiction? It's not a new question. I mean, it has been around, but in a different way. It has more broadly, the function and the value of literature has often been up for debate. And philosophers from antiquity have kind of questioned, some in defense or others in offense, about like, is literature valuable? Should we have literature in society or should it be part, right? So I'm thinking about, I mean, again, in a very Western context, I'm thinking about the debate between Plato and Aristotle. Now, Plato wrote this book, Republic, where he kind of described what an ideal society would look like, what citizens of that society would do and all that stuff, right? And in that discussion, he condemned the literature. He was mainly talking about poetry, said poetry should not be a part of society because it distracts. It is an imitation of reality, so it's never that powerful. Artists and poets who create poetry, they're not concerned with morality. Rather, they're concerned with beauty and art. So that kind of takes away the seriousness of a particular social issue. Aristotle, the other great Greek philosopher, who was a disciple of Plato, disagreed. He said, I mean, yeah, all that things that you say about poetry is true, but only partially. I mean, the fact that reading literature is about beauty or aesthetics, it's not a bad thing, because reading can move us in ways that can be helpful and productive in a social context, right? It can move us, make us feel a certain way about a social event, and that could determine how we morally judge a situation. So Aristotle, in that sense, kind of is for poetry, broadly for literature. And this is broadly, this debate has come up from generation to generation. And now we are asking the same question when it comes to representation of genocide. So, as there are two camps, I mean, even like talking about can genocide be represented in fiction or literature, has also two different camps, right? And you have like Adorno here, like a prominent cultural critic. He wrote this text called The Cultural Industry. He was against the idea of literary co-option. And he makes, and one of the reasons that he gives is very similar to an answer that we just got from one of you. He says, like, when genocide becomes a cultural property, of committed literature, it becomes like vulnerable to co-option and commodification, right? Which makes it, and it can be twisted, and it can be manipulated. The narrative can be made to serve a regime. So it overall, he said, like, it could be easily co-opted to promote the culture that actually gave rise to the crime. He has a good point. I mean, like, that is possible, but the question is that the end of the story, right? There are others who take a different view. Many believe, like Bernard Henry Levy would say, that the idea, like, victims of genocide have the right to express themselves, and they don't express themselves in objective historical truths, right? That their narratives is more flexible, and that's why literature is more closer to the reality of victims of war and genocide than actual historical representation, right? Then we have another one. Lynn Hunt makes an argument that is closer to what Aristotle had in mind, right? Like, Lynn Hunt says, novels made the point that all people are fundamentally similar because of their inner feelings. And many novels showcased in particular the desire for autonomy. In this way, reading novels created a sense of equality and empathy through passionate involvement with the narrative. So, I mean, somebody like Hunt would say that, I mean, yeah, the fact is that, say, all people are equal, right? And you can find that statement in a political document, in like the UN declaration and all that, right? But literatures have the capacity to make a statement that seems true, alive in the hearts and the minds of one's reading it, right? So through aesthetics, through passion, through involvement in the narrative, people not just, the idea that humans are equal is not just a distant theoretical idea, but it becomes alive when you witness it happening in real time in a literature, right? So that is what makes literature worth it in terms of in Hunt's opinion, right? And again, there are people who say, I mean, whether you want or not, you cannot separate literature from representations of war and genocide. It will inevitably happen. So the question is not whether literature should represent war and genocide. The question should be whether, what criteria do we have to evaluate those representations? So these are various positions that favor literary co-option, that favor, that say, yes, it is valuable to represent literature, war, genocide through literature. So circling back to the idea of historical truth about a genocide or about some kind of a catastrophe that happened, right? There's often like a war between what happened as opposed to what was represented, right? And that there is an often like multiple claims to authenticity when it comes to the happenings of a genocide, the events in a genocide, right? So this is a passage that kind of spotlights that issue, right? So it was observed, for instance, like victims of some kind of a genocide, Holocaust, or any other mass murder or genocide, often misremember because of trauma, right? So when they testify, or when they, when they testify, they often confuse facts, right? So does that mean their experience is inauthentic? I mean, that has been an accusation. So this quote, I'm not going to read it out, kind of gives you an example. So there was this woman who was in the camps in Auschwitz, and when she later, after surviving, when she testified, she remembered, I think there were like 4 chimneys that were blowing smoke, but she didn't have the correct number. And that led many historians to say, no, this is like not reality, right? But then there were others who said trauma doesn't deal with objective reality, and in any case. So, I mean, the fact that those events left an overwhelming impact on its victims can manifest itself in different ways, right? And so based on this, many, including Shoshana Feldman and Dory Law, said like literatures allow the flexibility to tell the stories of victims, a flexibility that is often unavailable in historical accounts. So we have established like there is like in testifying trauma, there is often a need for that flexibility, right? Because it's a kind of a venting of emotions, right? But there's another angle to like where many scholars think like historical account is not adequate to voice the traumas, the complexity of the traumas of survivors, right? And many have believed that historical accounts do not offer agency to the victims. Victims are often victims, powerless, and cannot speak in objective historical truth. I mean, again, but literature not only gives voice, has the power not only to give voice to the complex trauma experienced by victims, but it also has the ability for the victim to resume power and agency, where the victim can tell their stories on their own terms. So that is something that many scholars feel is very valuable, and literature often allows that to happen, right? So in this, the image that you see, it is I, Rigoberta Menchú. It is a memoir. Rigoberta Menchú she's still alive. She is a survivor of the genocide that happened in Guatemala in the Civil War. And she uses the memoir, which is a genre in itself. It is called testimonial, to not just testify to her traumas, but to use the platform to empower herself and others in her position. So yeah, so through the testimonial, the victim becomes an active agent of a transformative cultural and political project, right? Because the victim resumes ownership of their own stories, right? And they have the ability to mold national and international public opinion about the particular event. And that is something that many believe is valuable. So basically, circling back, literatures rely on mass appeal, right? So one is likely to read literatures, watch movies, and listen to stories through podcasts and stuff, right? More than reading objective historical books, right? So literatures in general has a wider mass appeal, right? And literature, there's something unique about literatures, right? Literatures often construct complex narrative worlds, right? Through world building, right? Literatures create complex characters who we can side with or who we hate, right? Literatures offer many point of views and perspectives on a particular event, right? So literatures have the ability to promote empathy for victims, right? In a way that history can never do. In fact, scholars have actually called literatures a training school for empathy because of all these things, right? Theoretically, one can train the mind to be more empathetic through the reading of literatures in a way that is not possible in history, in objective historical accounts, right? And since mass opinions and public feelings about events are truly important, literatures play a significant role in representations of genocide, right? Because and by literature, I mean broadly conceived, right? Like narratives that one consumes about things, right? Like, and these can be narratives, TV shows, movies, whatnot, right? So, I mean, we get our understanding of events comes from fiction, narratives, literature. So that is important, right? However, we have already, now that we have established that literature has the capacity to generate empathy for victims, but it is also true that not all literatures would do that, right? I mean, there are like racist, xenophobic, homophobic, transphobic texts out there, so many of them, right? Starting from Mein Kampf to whatnot, right? So, I mean, not all literatures generate empathy for victims. Some are there to mitigate empathy and like dehumanize, right? So we must be aware of that. I think our task is to identify what kind of literatures are generating empathy for victims as opposed to what others are generating antipathy for victims, right? Because many literatures out there do dehumanize, right? And I think like a prominent example is propaganda, right? Propaganda often functions to elevate the emotions and feelings of the group that it sides with and dehumanize the others that it is up against, right? So you see propaganda everywhere that recruits selective empathy, to represent a situation. So yeah, I mean, and you find propagandas very common in situations in places that experience war, right? Like those like ads that would encourage, go enlist, we need to protect our borders, we need to defeat the enemies, right? These are like propagandas that encourage you to assume that the other side is not deserving of the same empathy as your side. And that too is literature. And we must acknowledge that as well. Right? So it is through this acknowledgement that literatures can both allow the cultivation and the mitigation of empathy for victims. It is through this acknowledgement can we really do some productive work, thinking about the connections of literature and genocide. So all that said, as Asya introduced me, my specialization is modern South Asian literature and culture. And my evaluation of ideas like war and genocide primarily expresses through the lens of South Asia. Now, in South Asia, genocide is a term that is loaded. And I'm sure like Asya has gone over the more legal definitions, the 4 or 5 tier definitions of what would count as a genocide, what needs to be there for a mass event to count as a genocide, to be a genocide legally, right? So again, so in legal terms, to declare something as a genocide is often more complicated than just to say that it's a genocide. So we often say that, oh, that's a genocide. But the sad reality is saying is not the same as legally stating, right? And it may be a genocide, but in the legal eye, you have to like quantify all the different criteria for it to become a genocide, for it to be called a genocide, right? And that has its own like repercussions, because only when it's called a genocide, then some actions can be taken and all that. I'm not going to get into all that. But in India, there is something that is happening that is often unofficially understood as a genocide. It is called India's hidden apartheid. What is an apartheid, by the way? Does anybody know? Where have you heard this term?
An apartheid is like a very specific division between classes and castes in a system that becomes like an oppressive regime and like will often lead to like systemic violence.
Excellent. Pretty much, yeah. So in India, in South Asia, I would say, because mainly in India, but caste is a very prominent criteria of identification for determination of the worth of an individual, right? So in India, there is in India, Hinduism is a major religion, and a majority of the populations follow Hinduism, right? And Hinduism defines society as defines society and individual as through a caste system that it calls the Varna system. So a segment, the highest caste would be the priestly caste, the Brahmins, then the warriors, Kshatriyas, then the business class, Vaishyas, finally the Shudras and the Dalits, the lowest classes, lowest castes, which would range from like butchers to sweepers to peasants. And while in modern society, caste is not like an obvious criteria for discriminating an individual, it is a presence that is as palpable as racism in the United States, right? In US, I mean, officially, the government doesn't recognize like white supremacy or racism, right? But it's still there. It very much affects people's lives, right? Same happens in India when it comes to caste. Dalits experience discrimination ranging from limited job opportunities to violence. So that is the range of discrimination faced by Dalits, and it has been so for many, many years, centuries even. And that is often goes unnoticed. That is often pushed under the rug in India. That's why there are many human rights reports. There are many reports and documentaries out there have called it an hidden apartheid because nothing happens out in the open. Right. So in India, when we think about racism, mass killings, even genocide, human rights abuses, the first thing that comes up is the human rights abuses of Dalits. Every day, there are numerous cases of murder, rape, arson against Dalits. Many parts still of India still practice sexual slavery. An estimated 40 million people in India, among them 15 million children, are bonded laborers. A majority of them are Dalit. And because like social privilege works through the linkages of caste and class, and Dalits are doubly marginalized by class and caste, their situation is particularly vulnerable in South Asia, especially in India. Even the mass killings and genocides that have happened, official mass killings or genocides that have happened in India in recent history. The majority of victims have been Dalits. So that brings us to the topic of women and genocide or war. So women play a central role when it comes to these things, right? We have already discussed propaganda, right? So when there is oppression, there is often propaganda by the oppressing class, and women play a very major role in those propagandas, right? Women are often hailed or celebrated for their purity, right? Especially in war narratives. And usually if you see war propaganda, you will see villain. You will see like the representations of women as like embodiments of purity that must be defended for the sake of the nation, right? So, however, the image of purity is from the perpetrating group is of women of their side, because the women of the opposite side, the demonized, the villains, right? Their women are represented to be seductress, right? Temptresses, right? And there is a narrative that promotes that to conquer a land, to conquer a group, you must conquer the women, because that is something that a group values most, the purity. So if you attack the purity of the women from the opposing side, you attack the integrity of the group itself, right? So women have played these ideological roles, right? When it comes to propagandistic representations of war and genocide. So, I mean, the images that you see in front of you, it's a collage of different things, right? At least two of the images, the one with Mother India and the upper middle images, are Bollywood representations, right? So, and you see women as portrayed as pure, as good mothers, as good obedient wives, right? In such narratives. But on the right is an ancient image of women as seductresses. And this image has often been recruited by media to also show women as voluptuous temptresses who must be owned. So these two images often work side by side in popular representations of war and genocide, right? So, and the image that you see in the lower middle is an image from, is a popular poster that comes to us from the region of Kashmir, which is in the north of India. And Kashmir is one of the most militarized regions from India. and there is an ethnic conflict between Hindus and Muslims going on in Kashmir. The Indian and Kashmir is a location which is close to China and Pakistan because it's on the top of India. So Indian army, so that region is heavily safeguarded by the Indian army so that Pakistan or China don't infiltrate, right? There is, as I said, an ethnic angle to it, right? So the Indian government, which propagates a politics of Hindutva, which is like a militant form of Hinduism, often endorses ideas that Hindus must go to Kashmir and marry all the Muslim women and convert them to Hinduism. So ultimately, there are more Hindus than Muslims in the region, because while in India, Hindus are a majority, in Kashmir, there is a Muslim majority. So there is an ideological call to all Hindus from India to go and buy land in Kashmir and marry Muslim women so that majority can be flipped to Hindus. So you see, women play a very important role in these propagandistic works that are at play in situations of war and genocide. So, again, while propagandas instrumentalize and victimize women and representations, there are narratives that counter it as well. And I want to talk about two women writers and activists from India who counter these propagandistic projections by not only highlighting war and genocide from a marginalized minoritarian perspective, but also giving women agency in the process. So they are not just representing a situation from a marginalized perspective. You're not just getting history from the below, the history of the subaltern, but you are getting a history where the marginalized has agency, right? So the first person that I want to briefly talk about is Mahashata Devi. She recently passed away a few years back. She was a Bengali writer and an activist. She was a leftist who worked for the rights and the empowerment of tribal people in Bengal. Again, tribal communities are also majorly Dalits. They are low in caste and class, right? So they have been the tribal communities from India and South Asia in general, which would include Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. The tribal communities from these regions have been some of the most vulnerable and exploited communities. So Mahashata Devi dedicated her life to the empowerment of tribal communities from Bengal, to an extent that she was unofficially called the mother of the Sabars, which was a tribal community from Bengal itself. She not she used to spend time with these tribal communities, work for do advocacy work, but also she spent a lot of time translating their stories to Bengali and then to English. So yeah, so she wrote many of the stories that she wrote was about highlighting the kind of oppressions that these tribal communities experience on a day-to-day basis, and B, her stories empowered tribal and Dalit individuals and experiences, especially the experience of women. So one of the things, because Mahashita Devi wrote about Bengal, there are two major things that intersected in her writings, historical events. The first historical event was the Naxalite movement. So the Naxalite movement started in 1967. It was a local tribal peasant uprising against landlords against a landlord or a community of like elite landlords who perpetrated violence against tribals, right? And then the Naxalite movement actually comes from the village. The name Naxalite comes from a village called Naxalbari, where landlords brutally murdered some laboring populations, and that led to a mass uprising, tribal uprising, right? And gradually this uprising started gaining strength. Students and people from the cities started coming in and joining, and it became a big movement, and it is still going on. And it kind of represents the struggle of it has now become a communist-led separatist movement against government encroachment upon tribal lands. So the red part that you see in the map of India is called the Red Corridor. And this is the region where the Naxalite movement has taken effect. So, I mean, you can see it started in 1967, and it's a movement that is still going strong. And the Naxalite movement centrally is a historical presence in Mahashita Devi's stories. The second event that plays a very significant role in the stories of Mahashita Devi is the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971. Now, Bangladesh is, today we know Bangladesh as an independent country. But when Pakistan was created, Bangladesh was not an independent country. It was Pakistan and then East Pakistan. So if you see this map, here you see Bangladesh on your right, I think, and to the left at the top, you have Pakistan. So there was a time when Bangladesh was not independent. It was just a part of Pakistan, right? So the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1947 was a war where people in Bangladesh like rallied for independence from Pakistan to be a nation in itself, right? And the story that happens with the creation of every nation, that it was a very brutal process, right? The death toll is estimated between 300,000 to, I mean, goes on, right? And this was a genocide where rape was used in a systematic manner to against victims, against the perpetrators. So this is one of those genocides that has a unusually high rape number. And Bengali women from tribal communities, again, as I said, a majority of the victims of even this genocide were Dalits and tribals, were declared as public property who could be raped and pillaged with impunity. So Davies' stories explore these interconnections of the Naxalite movement and the Bangladesh Liberation Front. It explores through its stories the brutality of rape as a weapon of war and genocide. However, at the same time, her stories are not just stories that you hear from the side of the dominant class in power. All her stories are stories that you hear from the voice of Dalits, of tribals. And it is not her who makes up these stories. These are stories that she has encountered herself while living with these tribal communities. So she is just a facilitator of these stories. These stories are not her own, but she, in a way, offers a platform to amplify the stories that are deeply have roots in the tribal communities themselves. So it's a story of tribal resistance that highlights the perspectives of tribals themselves. Okay. The second figure that I want to briefly talk about before we conclude is Phullan Devi. Now, Phullan Devi, when it comes to Indian politics and media, has been a very controversial figure. She died, she was assassinated in 2001 when she was a pretty influential political figure. She was an activist, she was a politician, and she was a bandit from Uttar Pradesh, India, which is in the northern parts of India. She was like a Robin Hood figure who was part of a larger gang who would steal from the rich and give to the poor. So she was arrested. She was, again, she was a victim of rape. And finally, when she became a politician, she dedicated her voice in advocating for caste equality. And this is the region in Uttar Pradesh that she talks about, that she comes from. And her advocacy work was about highlighting the oppressions that people from her caste face from this region. And if you remember, we initially talked about I, Rigoberta Menchú, the memoir of Rigoberta Menchú, who lived through the Guatemalan civil wars and then wrote a memoir, or then created a memoir with the aim of telling the story of the genocide. A similar project happened through to the life of Fulan Devi. And the writing of this autobiography, the writing of this memoir itself was a very complicated process, because Fulan Devi herself was not educated. So what happened was she collaborated with writers and translators, and she testified to her story, which was then transcribed. Every page was then read out to her, and then she signed off on every page. And that led to the creation of the memoir that was called I, Fulan Devi, kind of echoing I, Rigoberta Menchú, because the ambitions of both the memoir are similar, not just to highlight caste-based oppressions, but to empower, offer an agency to women telling their stories. So my final PowerPoint slide, circling back to the first question. Should genocide be represented through fiction? I mean, I feel yes, but I do want to hear from you guys.
Hearing always different than some others, like really new material for you. What do you think?
I also agree that I think the genocide should be represented in fiction, just because I think it can give an added layer that sometimes history can't always do. But I think there's like still are issues with it being with fiction, so it should kind of not be the only way it's represented, but just an added tool to help our understanding.
Excellent, pretty much. I agree with that. It is like, I mean, yeah, I mean, we should, in general, have a more flexible understanding of narratives, right? I feel there's a need to do away with the politics of authenticity, because this politics of authenticity does more harm than good, right? It's like when we establish something as authentic, then we automatically overlook others as inauthentic. And again, there may be contexts where this rule wouldn't apply, of course, but when it comes to narratives of representations, I feel a more flexible understanding is helpful. I mean, of course, we should not blindly say that literatures categorically help with positive representations of like genocide and war, because as my presentation hopefully showed, that's not the case, because propagandas are literatures too, and they do more harm than good, right? But there are literatures that are used to voice and empower the victims, and we should, and I think there should be an effort to understand and study those.
Okay, so any questions for Arnav before we let him go? Anything from particular case studies that we touched upon or in general about? Yeah, go ahead.
This was like less about the fiction side of things. I was just wondering, about the Naxalite. Oh. I was wondering how you would like kind of characterize the ethnic makeup of the Naxalite movement, and like militia groups. Would you say that like kind of part of their marginalization is due to them being like overwhelmingly one type of caste or another?
I mean, like even when an overwhelming population were affected, are Dalits, but they come from like vastly different castes, even within like the category, broader like categories of tribals and Dalits, right? That they're like for they come from like every different village has a different caste. Even within a village, there may be like 5 different castes. So I mean, so there is like a diversity in that scale. And Naxalite movement is like, which has been going on for like decades now, has like assumed a complexity that is very hard to like identify, because during the 60s and the 70s, I mean, there was like many populations in the city, for instance, in urban areas like say Delhi and Calcutta, like were attracted to this cause, right? And they migrated almost to some of these areas to advocate for tribals, right? That kind of led, at least in, I think, the 70s, to the creation of the Communist Party in India. That is still a big presence in Bengal. But again, like it kind of evolved, the whole movement assumed like a pan, like national dimension, right? So I mean, now, I mean, it's still going on. I mean, and then like the state has declared Naxalites as terrorists. So they are like often seen as terrorists. But again, and like all movements, right? In many cases, the larger objective gets lost. In some cases, there are many regions where like many are still holding on to those ideals. So as usually social movements do, this has happened, and it has devolved into something like massive now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, because I think that memoirs are really still have like a foundation of truth. I'm curious to know what you think of fiction that is true, like that is like entirely fictional, even maybe historically inaccurate. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on pieces like that.
I mean, again, I feel that it is important, as I feel Lynn Hunt kind of pointed out, right? Like, truth is a contextual idea, right? And truth is not limited by what's historical and objective, right? So novels and many other like historical fictions, right? For instance, like they might base the context, historical context, but what is happening to characters in the novel could be entirely fictional, right? But if they are able to communicate some of the pain experienced by the victims, if the work is able to like influence the way the reader sees the situation, especially from a marginalized perspective, I feel no matter the genre, it is a valuable exercise. I mean, think about like comic books, right? There are many comic books that have like, I'm actually teaching Persepolis, which is a comics book that talks about the experiences of a little girl in Iran through the shift of the rise of authoritarianism, right? Now, one can say that a lot of what happens in this comic book in this graphic novel is fiction. Why should we read it? But Persepolis is one text that offered to the world a story that media, you don't find in media, right? It offered a story not just from a marginalized point of view, a point of view that was actively crushed by the authoritarian regime in Iran, but a point of view that you get from a person who experienced the oppression. So, and no matter what genre that is, whether it's a serious historical novel or whether it's a graphic novel or a comic book, I mean, I think that's the valuable exercise.
That's a great example, Arnav. One of our professors at CART used that novel in teaching his human rights and literature course. He unfortunately recently passed. Bob Tobin, about whom you've heard most a lot probably recently.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a grad student here at CART, I actually was his TA when he was teaching human rights and literature with the help of this graphic novel.
Mm-hmm.
And it was amazing to see how it would engage students in conversations that they would never think of when they thought about Iran or human rights violations there, because indeed, this is, recently we've heard a lot about what's happening there, so it has become more relevant. But it has been relevant there for all these years. It's not just this past year that we see some reflections in media because there are protests. This has been an ongoing process for decades. And I totally agree that this graphic novel does a really great job of conveying the message in a way, in a digestible manner that memoir, or even as you said, a serious historical novel might not probably be able to do. So thank you for bringing that example.
And it gives you a glimpse of a feminism that doesn't like devolve into a mimicry of like what Western feminists think happens outside. It's a very like complex narrative from the perspective of a girl about her experiences of like in living through the regime.
Exactly, yes, totally agree. Any other questions? If not, we will thank you, Arnav. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was awesome. Thank you for this opportunity. I had such fun doing this.
I'm sure we all learned a lot because you talked and touched upon topics that are not widely discussed. Some of them, like for instance, the liberation war in Bangladesh and the genocide, we discussed in our course, but many of the topics we touched upon, and especially many of the actors, many of those agents, we are not familiar with. And it's very important to have a glimpse of that knowledge. And I hope to have you in my future courses as well, because I keep learning a lot from you, and I'm hoping that students do the same. Thank you, and we'll stop the recording here and the meeting as well.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.